Nathan was just a waiter, invisible to the rich guests of Silver Heights, but when a cruel woman forced him to play the piano just to humiliate him, no one expected what happened next. His music changed everything. Stay till the end to witness his unbelievable journey. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means everything. Silver Heights was a world of gleaming chandeliers, polished marble floors, and hushed conversations between the city's most powerful and affluent. It was a sanctuary of wealth where only the privileged were allowed to indulge in extravagant dining. The waiters, dressed in crisp uniforms, moved through the room like shadows, unseen and unacknowledged by the patrons they served. Among them was Nathan, a young black man whose polite smile masked years of being overlooked. Nathan had worked at Silver Heights for nearly 2 years. He was efficient, respectful, and disciplined. Exactly the kind of employee the restaurant prided itself on. To the guests, however, he was little more than furniture. He took orders, poured wine, and cleared plates without so much as a glance in his direction. Some refused to acknowledge his presence at all, while others treated him with the same detached indifference they reserved for service workers beneath their notice. He had learned to ignore the small humiliations, the way some guests would snatch their hands away if he accidentally brushed against them. The occasional muttered remark about how surprising it was to see someone like him in such an upscale place. The way certain patrons waited for a white waiter to approach before giving their orders. Nathan endured it all in silence, just as he had been taught. He could not afford to lose this job. What no one at Silver Heights knew was that Nathan carried a secret. Beneath the quiet obedience, beneath the uniform that reduced him to nothing more than an extension of the restaurant's service, was a talent that transcended everything these people believed about him. Nathan was a pianist, a gifted one. His fingers could breathe life into melodies that spoke of sorrow, of struggle, of hope. But no one here would ever suspect that. In their eyes, he was just another nameless worker meant to blend into the background. That evening, the atmosphere in the restaurant buzzed with quiet excitement. A particularly notable guest had arrived, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. She was an institution in high society, a woman of immense wealth and influence. Dressed in an elegant gown that shimmered under the chandelier light, she commanded attention wherever she went. Those who knew her were well aware of her sharp tongue and her insatiable need to assert her superiority over those she deemed beneath her. Nathan had served her before. He remembered how she never looked at him directly, only through him, as though he were a ghost. He knew the routine: approach, deliver, step away, remain invisible. But tonight, something was different. As he approached her table, carrying a tray of champagne flutes, he noticed her eyes flick toward him. For a fleeting moment, there was recognition, not of him as a person, but as an opportunity for her amusement. He set the glasses down carefully, his movements practiced and precise. Mrs. Whitmore tilted her head, watching him with a smirk. "You're quite poised for a waiter," she remarked, her voice dripping with condescension. Nathan felt the weight of the table's attention shift to him. The other guests at her table, equally privileged and entitled, turned to observe the exchange like spectators at a private performance. "Tell me," she continued, swirling her wine lazily, "do you have any talents, or is carrying trays the only skill you've managed to master?" Nathan hesitated for a fraction of a second. He had been in situations like this before. Subtle taunts disguised as idle conversation meant to put him in his place. His instinct told him to nod politely, murmur something deferential, and move along. But before he could stop himself, the words slipped out. "I play the piano, ma'am." Mrs. Whitmore raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, feigning surprise. "The piano? Now that's unexpected." A murmur of amusement ran through the table. One of the men chuckled. Nathan kept his expression neutral. He could feel the weight of every gaze pressing down on him, waiting for him to falter. Mrs. Whitmore leaned back in her chair, clearly entertained by the idea. "Are you any good?" "I do my best," Nathan replied evenly. The table laughed, a soft ripple of condescending amusement. Mrs. Whitmore's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Well, well, there's a grand piano right over there," she said, gesturing toward the glossy instrument in the corner of the room. "Why don't you entertain us? Show us what you've got." Nathan felt his stomach tighten. The restaurant had gone eerily quiet, the surrounding tables now fully invested in the spectacle unfolding before them. Someone scoffed, just loud enough for him to hear. "This should be good." Another guest whispered to their companion, "I bet he's going to play something ridiculous." Nathan's pulse quickened. He hadn't performed in front of an audience in years. This was no ordinary audience. This was a room filled with people who expected him to fail, who wanted to watch him embarrass himself for their amusement. A voice inside him told him to decline, to walk away, but another voice, one that spoke of something deeper, of pride, of defiance, refused to let him. He exhaled slowly. If they wanted a show, he would give them one. With measured steps, he turned away from the table and walked towards the piano. The murmur of conversation faded behind him. As he approached the instrument, he placed his fingers gently on the keys. The polished surface felt familiar, comforting, even in the midst of the scrutiny surrounding him. Then, in the silence of the room, he began to play. The first note rang out, soft and delicate, barely disturbing the hush that had settled over the restaurant. At first, there was nothing but silence, no reaction, no shift in the condescending expressions of the onlookers. Some exchanged smirks, still convinced that this was nothing more than an amusing diversion, a moment of entertainment at a waiter's expense. Nathan's fingers moved with a hesitant grace, as if testing the waters. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from something deeper, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to embrace in a long time. The music grew bolder, filling the space with something that had never been heard in Silver Heights before. It was not the rehearsed, polite background melodies that played from the speakers, nor was it the soulless technicality of a trained performer playing for approval. It was raw. It was real. At first, the mocking whispers continued. A woman at a nearby table let out a short, dismissive laugh. A man muttered, "Let's see if he can keep up without fumbling." Another snorted. "They always exaggerate their talents." But then, as the melody unfolded, the laughter faded, replaced by something else. Nathan let the memories flood him, let the music carry him beyond the walls of the restaurant, beyond the expectations and the invisible barriers placed around him. He thought of his mother, of the small apartment where she used to sit beside him, guiding his hands over worn piano keys. He thought of the way she used to close her eyes when she listened, how she told him that music was his true voice. She had always believed in him. She had always told him that his talent was greater than any limitation the world tried to place upon him. The composition grew deeper, richer, his fingers gliding effortlessly across the keys. The skepticism in the room turned into stunned silence. The guests, once eager to see him falter, now found themselves captivated. A few leaned forward slightly, as if drawn in against their will. Mrs. Whitmore, who had orchestrated this moment to humiliate him, sat motionless, her previous amusement gone. Nathan's confidence built with every note. The initial tension in his shoulders melted away as he gave himself over to the music completely. The melody swirled, telling a story without words, a story of struggle and perseverance, of pain and triumph. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the weight of the room had changed. He knew in that moment that they could no longer look at him the same way. He played not for them, not for their approval, but for himself. The final note lingered in the air, its echo stretching across the vast silence that followed. No one spoke. No one moved. For the first time that evening, Nathan was not invisible. Then a single clap broke the silence. It came hesitantly at first, as if the person making it was unsure of their own reaction. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant erupted into applause. Some guests stood, clapping louder, murmuring in astonishment. A woman dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. A few guests, still clinging to their prejudices, hesitated, their expressions caught between surprise and discomfort, as if struggling with the realization that they had been wrong about him. Mrs. Whitmore had not moved. Her face, once smug and expectant of his failure, now bore an unreadable expression. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but closed it again, for once unable to find the words. Nathan rose from the piano bench, his heart still racing. He did not bow. He did not wait for validation. He simply turned and walked away, back toward the kitchen, past the stunned faces, past the whispers of admiration. As he pushed through the swinging doors, his co-workers were waiting for him. Their expressions were no longer indifferent or mocking. They were wide-eyed, amazed, and, perhaps for the first time, respectful. "I had no idea you could do that," one of them finally said. Nathan smiled slightly, the adrenaline still coursing through him. He had taken a moment designed to humiliate him and turned it into something unforgettable. But as much as this victory meant, he knew that this was only the beginning. He had proven himself tonight, not just to them, but to himself. And now, for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was only the start of something greater. Nathan stood in the kitchen for a moment, his heart still racing as the distant sound of applause faded behind the swinging doors. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, but instead of fear or anxiety, there was something else, a quiet, simmering satisfaction. He had taken their mockery and transformed it into something they could not ignore. He had played not for their approval, but for himself, and yet, for the first time, they had seen him. The moment was short-lived. As he turned toward the sink to wash his hands, the kitchen staff erupted in murmurs. A few of the line cooks, who had never paid him any real attention, exchanged glances before sneaking another look at him. Some of his fellow waiters, the same ones who had treated him as just another worker struggling to get by, now regarded him with something closer to awe. One of them, James, a server who had been working at Silver Heights for years, smirked as he leaned against the counter. "Well, damn. Didn't see that coming," he said, shaking his head. "You were actually good." Another waiter, Matthew, scoffed. "Yeah, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. It was one song. They liked it because it was unexpected." He looked Nathan up and down. "Don't think it changes anything." Nathan said nothing. He wasn't interested in arguing. He could already sense the shift happening around him. Some of them had newfound respect for him. Others, like Matthew, resented it. That wasn't his problem. He had done what he set out to do. Before he could grab a tray and return to work, the kitchen doors burst open and one of the managers stepped inside. "Nathan," she said, breathless, as if she had rushed back from the dining area, "come with me." He frowned. "Why?" She motioned for him to follow. "Just come. The guests are asking for you." Nathan hesitated. He had expected them to clap, maybe even say a few words of surprise before moving on with their expensive meals and meaningless conversations. But now they were calling for him. He wasn't sure how to feel about that. Still, he followed her back out onto the floor where the energy had completely shifted. Silver Heights was no longer filled with the quiet, restrained murmurs of the wealthy. It was buzzing. Guests were speaking in excited tones, gesturing toward the piano, toward the spot where Nathan had been sitting just minutes ago. A few turned their heads the moment he stepped into the room. Applause broke out again, this time directed solely at him. A well-dressed older man at a nearby table lifted his wine glass toward him. "Incredible performance, young man," he said. "Truly remarkable." Another guest, a woman with diamond earrings that glittered under the chandelier light, leaned forward eagerly. "Do you take requests? You simply must play again." Nathan glanced at the piano, his hands still tingling from his earlier performance. This was new. This was something he hadn't been prepared for. Then came the voice he had been waiting for, though not in the way he had expected. Mrs. Whitmore had remained silent throughout the commotion, watching from her seat with an unreadable expression. Now she finally spoke. "Well," she said, tapping her fingers against the table, "that was unexpected." The table around her had grown quiet, all of her companions waiting to see how she would respond. She had been the one to challenge him, to set him up for failure. And yet, she had been wrong. Nathan met her gaze evenly. "You play well," she admitted after a moment. "Better than I expected." There was a hesitation in her voice, a reluctance to acknowledge his skill. The condescension was still there, buried beneath her carefully measured words. Nathan simply nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." She studied him for a moment longer before waving a hand dismissively. "Well, don't just stand there. If they want another song, give them another song." A murmur of agreement rippled through the restaurant. Some of the guests were already placing money on the table, as if this were some sort of exclusive show. Nathan's stomach twisted. He had spent years dreaming of performing in places like this, but not like this. Not as an afterthought. Not as a spectacle for the rich to indulge in when it suited them. For a brief moment, he considered walking away. But then he remembered what it had felt like to play, to let the music speak for him in a way words never could. He had never cared about their approval. And he wasn't going to start now. Slowly, he made his way back to the piano, feeling every set of eyes on him. He sat down, took a deep breath, and placed his fingers on the keys. And then, with all the emotion and power still left inside him, he began to play again. The first note resonated through the air, silencing any lingering conversations. This time, there were no smirks, no hushed whispers of mockery. The audience that had once anticipated his failure now watched in captivated silence. Nathan felt it in the way their postures shifted, in the way some of them leaned forward unconsciously, as if afraid to miss even a single note. He played not because they asked him to, not because Mrs. Whitmore expected him to perform like a trained pet, but because music was the only thing that had ever truly belonged to him. The melody was different from before, heavier, filled with an intensity that spoke of something deeper than simple entertainment. His fingers glided over the keys, commanding the grand piano with a precision that came not from practice but from instinct. The emotions within him, the years of being overlooked, the quiet humiliations, the suppressed anger, the longing to be seen for more than what others assumed. He poured all of it into the music. Each note resonated like a heartbeat, filling the space in a way no spoken words ever could. The audience was entranced. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the melody carry them somewhere beyond the lavish restaurant. Others sat frozen, their earlier arrogance stripped away, replaced by something closer to awe. Even the servers who had once ignored him stood near the back of the room, drawn to the performance despite themselves. Nathan did not play for their approval, but he could feel their perception of him shifting with each passing moment. He was no longer just a waiter, no longer just an unseen figure blending into the background. For the first time, they saw him. As a final note lingered in the air, a heavy silence followed. No one dared to move, as if breaking the stillness would shatter whatever spell had been cast. Then, slowly, the applause began again. This time it was not hesitant, it was thunderous. A standing ovation rippled through the room, people rising from their seats, clapping with a fervor that was almost desperate. Nathan stood, heart pounding, his hands still tingling from the force of his own playing. He did not bow, he did not smile. He simply let the moment exist, let it settle over them like a weight they had yet to fully comprehend. Mrs. Whitmore had remained seated throughout the applause, her expression carefully composed. For once, she was silent. No smug remarks, no condescending praise, just a look of measured contemplation as she studied him. Nathan turned away from the piano, stepping off the small platform where it stood. He did not need her approval. He had never needed it. The applause was still ringing in his ears as he walked past the sea of wealthy patrons who had, for so long, seen him as nothing. He made his way toward the kitchen, feeling their eyes follow him, but this time it was not with dismissal. This time it was with recognition. He had shattered their expectations, and there was no undoing it. As he reached the kitchen doors, one of the senior servers caught his arm. "Nathan," he said breathlessly, "the owner wants to talk to you." Nathan hesitated. He had expected reactions, but not this. "Why?" The server shook his head. "Just go. People have been calling in already, asking about you. They want to know when you'll be playing again." Nathan frowned. It had only been minutes since he left the piano, and already things were shifting. He felt the air around him change, the weight of expectation settling onto his shoulders. He was no longer invisible. They had finally seen him. But now the question remained, what would he do with that? Nathan stood in the restaurant's office, the weight of the past hour settling over him like a storm waiting to break. Across from him sat Mr. Caldwell, the owner of Silver Heights, a man known for his strict professionalism and an unshakable focus on maintaining the restaurant's elite reputation. Tonight, however, his usual measured demeanor had been replaced with something closer to intrigue. He studied Nathan for a long moment, fingers steepled beneath his chin, before finally speaking. "I've been getting calls all night," he said. "People want to know when they can see you perform again."
Nathan remained silent, waiting. He wasn't sure what Caldwell wanted from him. The man leaned forward slightly. "I have an offer for you," he continued. "You've clearly made an impression. We'd like to have you play here. Regularly. You'd still keep your position, of course, but on nights like these you'd be part of the experience. Our very own in-house pianist." Nathan's stomach twisted. The words should have excited him. For years he had dreamed of playing for people, of sharing his music beyond the confines of his apartment. But something about the way Caldwell spoke, like he was a novelty, a performance piece rather than an artist, made his skin crawl. He had spent years being invisible to these people, and now, because he had shown them something extraordinary, they wanted to claim him as part of their spectacle. He glanced down at his hands, the same hands that had carried trays through this restaurant night after night, ignored and unacknowledged. Now, they were something valuable, but only because they had proven useful. "I'll think about it," Nathan said finally, his voice even. Caldwell raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Take your time," he said, "but don't take too long. This kind of opportunity doesn't come often." Nathan left the office, his mind racing. The moment he stepped back into the kitchen, the energy shifted. Servers who had never spoken more than a few words to him now offered congratulatory nods. One cook clapped him on the back. Even Matthew, who had sneered at him earlier, looked uncertain now, as if unsure how to categorize Nathan anymore. He didn't linger. He stepped outside into the cold night air, inhaling deeply, letting the crispness clear his thoughts. The world felt different. He was different. 2 days later, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. When he answered, a polished voice introduced itself as a representative from a prestigious music academy. They had seen a recording of his performance. Someone at the restaurant had filmed it, and it had spread faster than he could have imagined. They wanted to offer him a place, a scholarship, a chance to pursue music without the burden that had always held him back. For the first time in years, the path ahead of him was not just a distant dream, but a reality within his reach. 1 week later, Mrs. Whitmore returned to Silver Heights. This time, when Nathan walked past her table, she did not look through him. She looked at him. "You taught me something that night," she said, her voice quieter, stripped of its usual arrogance. "Talent and greatness can come from anywhere." Nathan gave her a polite nod, but he didn't linger. He didn't need her approval. He never had. Silver Heights was no longer his destination. It was simply where his journey had begun. Nathan's talent shattered expectations and proved that true greatness can never be ignored. But this is just the beginning of his journey. What do you think about his story? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life.